Okay, this lesson concerns when a system becomes so complicated or complex that it is no longer stable. It is a result of what's called bifurcation. And I'll just read that from this little book here. Those of you that actually are using the evaluative approach, where you're actually evaluating and you want an objective way of doing it. In this very good book, by the way, Handbook of Human Performance Technology. I think you can get it online as far as a PDF maybe. So, not me, I've got the old hard copy. But it says here on page 1257, bifurcation, as changes happen throughout the system, and this could be what we refer to as constructs, and the system tradition, I guess now, of having constructs, they're called mental models. And for example, if it's about eschatology, it's called a eschatological construct, and they're fallible. And for example, you can read charts like the very popular Larkin's charts. Well, those are not inspired, and no one who seriously studies would say they were, but they're a good mental model to help give an infrastructure, a scaffolding to begin to build on. But now in this case, we're talking about when do we stop and when's it time to reset. And in the very, as I would call it, the historical, grammatical perspective, and people who labor in word and doctrine as the seminary taught us and trained us, or as Dr. John Penn, who developed his own approach, holistic hermeneutics, which means include everything. Don't practice source avoidance, which is based on biases that we all have. Well, in that case, in that particular high discipline, high, as you would call it, scriptural adherence or text support, reset the landmarks. It was a landmark was a metaphor. So when is it time to reset? Well, it says here that when the system bifurcates into 2, then 4, then multiple numbers of paths. And we've seen that with things like pre, mid, post, pre-wrath, eschatological paths in the larger domain called futurism. So you can see that it can begin to expand as this says. It says when a system reaches maximum instability, then we have opportunities for reordering it, stopping, reset, and start again. So that's what we do here at imcoine.org, the Apologetic and Outreach Ministry of Landmark Missionary Baptist Church. And that is very helpful to some of you to understand, those of you that are actually working using the languages and are studying and then evaluating constructs. And remember this, conquering the content, teach you how to take a large amount of content, break it up into chunks, make it manageable for that you can evaluate it and understand each part. Then you can understand the outcome of all the data, which in a word we like to say, when the when the outcome is greater than the sum of its parts. And you don't want to miss that opportunity and that experience. And to tell you about resetting landmarks, for example, here's Dr. Penn's mathematics book, Fundamentals of Modern Mathematics. This is 1964. So this book goes back to fundamentals, very basic core elements, foundational elements of mathematics, and it combines it with logic and reason. So he encouraged us who do research, and he guides us and directs us, and we can rely on his consultation, his insights. But he points us to go back, further back. So a lot of what we'll discuss today, and this will be brief, I won't continue to ramble, but you notice bifurcation is what's taking place. Everything's now duplicitous. It's now into 3 paths, 4 paths. It's becoming, as we know, the system's becoming very unstable. It can be so confusing now for people that they're not really sure where to begin, because so many either this or this has now become either this, or this. So it's not really even a false dichotomy anymore. That would include just 2 things. We're looking now at why we reset and why it's very much admired among those of us who were trained in the tools of languages, Bible languages, the practice, the science of biblical interpretation, and the systematic theology, which takes a categorical approach. Because for example, in the systematic theology course I took at the seminary, we began where most people end. So we would start with this or this, for example, limited or unlimited atonement, for example. Then we go study the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation on what is the Bible doctrine of atonement according to the context in which it appears. And then we would develop a synthesis of that. And then we'd have to reduce it to a very concise expression of 5,000 words or less. We couldn't exceed 5,000, and we had to at least have demonstrated our research had led us to be able to produce that much. And then we had to reflect that we covered all the core elements. And in hermeneutics, we were trained in how to apply the tools, the languages, how to understand context. So with all that training, it was not that difficult to see from the vantage point we have, especially those who've gone before us. But then, for example, and my viewpoint is from a consultative view. So we'll just look very quickly and see what we've got. But we have two theisms. If you say yes, it's open or closed. That's the prevailing categories. Those are formed categories, you know that. If it's open, you need to just practice source avoidance to anything that might support closed. If you're closed, you practice source avoidance of anything that might support open. If you come here and practice that, let's say no, then you'll practice source inclusion. You'll evaluate the formed categories, which are open or closed. Then you'll define, document, and disclose the fallible elements, and then publish your work. You want to share the work, that's what we do. Bring it to class, place it online, use Facebook, social media, any platforms that are out there. Use YouTube so that others who want to engage in collaborative learning, collective reasoning, we can all advantage ourselves in making sure or helping assure that we have the core elements. And for example, because of bifurcation, a person might not notice that what's missing here is living theism. So no, there is no such thing as two theisms, and you don't need either one of these. You can take the phrase living God, you can go from the Torah all the way to the Apocalypse, take the context in which that phrase appears. You can even find true and living God, the spirit of the living God. You can find that phrase, and then you can notice the implications of that. And then you could truly say you have studied theism according to the Bible. And then you can notice that when you bring living into the equation, you understand that that is the true unconcealed reality of the nature of God's being, His knowing, and all that we otherwise understand. But that's a real simple path. If you say yes, you want to practice source avoidance, well then you just stop. It's called the immobilization of thought. And for example, accretion, that's just a word for things just continue to grow and expand. In a project, for example, you might experience creep. So when you're studying, you might start creeping away from what your original subject was. What was the original topic? You might start abandoning context. You might start abandoning inspired categories, those words that we can look and reference in a lexicon. So you can kind of drift away, creep away, and then layer it away. Now here we have two ages of the earth. This one's very recent. In the last 40 years, it's really become energized. There's a lot of emotion. Again, that doesn't really add to what we're doing. It doesn't solve bifurcation. You have two ages. Yes, if you believe that and you accept one versus the other, then you young or old, either one, you practice source avoidance. If yes, you stop. So you hold your line and you say, I'm an old earther. Now what was phenomenal to me was to watch people at the highest level of biblical scholarship actually switch sides. But they only remained between young or old. They didn't bring anything to the equation, to the conversation, except what was already there. So it's similar to just playing the cards you're dealt, and you might not be familiar with the entire deck of cards, and you might not notice that you're short a few cards. So in this case, this is sustained because of the error of omission. Numbers are not involved. Again, you really go back to some of the most basic, which it sounds easy, but that's actually a little, in many ways, it's more difficult to go back and think clearly and notice the profound implications of the clarity. For example, in Hebrew, it's pictographic, it's phonetic, and it's numeric, such as the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet. In its numeric expression, it means 1 and 1,000. And when you spell it out, Aleph, and you write it out, the three letters, it equals 1, 1, 1. So then you find places in the Bible where it says these three ones are one. So we have one God, three persons, one being and three persons. So you can find that and see that in the, but you'd have to really want to move away from simply the monotheism versus polytheism, because those two, for example, in that bifurcation, they omit the reality that we have one God yet three persons. So the Bible is very unique, such as the Bible, what the Bible actually says here is just as unique to earth ageism and creation as the Trinity is to theism, living that is to the Godhead. And here, living theism is just as unique to this, open or closed, which is both sides omit the feature, the chief feature, living. So we couldn't imagine as Christians a Godhead without the Trinity, and yet you can see in Christianity we have things that are missing key features or landmarks that would be just as essential to these being reflected or reflecting Christianity in the Bible in the most advanced way, as we consider the Godhead being properly represented only when the personhood of God is reflected in the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So, many soteriologies, if you say yes, I'm just using CALM, the four horsemen, if you will, Calvinism, Arminianism, Lutheranism, Molinism. If you say yes to that and you go here to practice source avoidance, if you acknowledge soteriologies and the multiplicity of them, then you just stop once you picked yours, and then you begin to practice accretion. You layer it, you buttress it, you continue to add even more words. Some people say they're 2-point Calvinist, 3.4 up to 5. Some are high, moderate, low, hyper. So all that starts happening when you pick one. And then, of course, it's an immobilization of thought, because as admirable as it is, all the ways you can express yourself as a Calvinist, it is unbeknownst to those who adamantly assert those things that they're actually engaged in a process called accretion. You're just layering it and you're creeping further and further away. So if you say no, you don't want to accept many soteriologies, you come over, for example, and you take your young earth, you practice source inclusion, evaluate formed category of young, where'd that come from, then define, document, disclose the fallible elements. You take the old assertion, do the same thing. You do the same thing with open or close, process it. You can take each of these four soteriologies and process them. And I'm not really sure what the implication of Molinism is, how it has become such an essential thing to understand. I've not noticed it contributing much to the conversation, but it's there. Now you come over here to multiple gospels, yes, but the Bible says there's no such thing. Paul said that's a different gospel. He said which is not another, which means it doesn't exist as a gospel at all. And it's works of law or the faith of Christ. If it's works of law, you have to practice source avoidance. You have to avoid, for example, what we learned in this class, oida, which in English is idea, in Latin is video. It's also our understanding of when you're conscious of something, that awareness you have. And that in Galatians 2:16 says, knowing, by getting it, by being conscious of the truth that no kind of man is justified out from any kind of law, but rather out from the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. So those who advocate a different gospel have not even read in Galatians where it's not even a gospel at all. And those who define the righteousness of God as something less than the faithfulness of Jesus Christ, they have found a definition outside the scriptures. So this is enough to just explain that when do we reset? Well, when things become as emotive, well, you can notice here, how would we have a theism without living theism? And how would we have this young versus old when we don't define the difference between duration and decay, which we all admit and know in the Bible? Why would we banter between soteriologies when every time you pick one, then your bias skews your view and modifies your approach to, you might start proof texting a lot, which no text supports anything fallible. And then you come over here, you might find yourself, as some have said, Calvinism is the gospel. Well, that's not even a possibility. Calvinism is fallible, the gospel is infallible. Some say Arminianism, Lutheranism, Moline, whatever all these are, they say that is the gospel. Well, actually, that's not possible. So that's enough. It's a good lesson. It's a lot of material, but it's concisely presented. I'll get out of the way and let you see it. But any of these, for example, I could not accept a Godhead without the Trinity, but to somehow accept an understanding of the earth ageism without the Bible numbers, which are words in the Bible. And then over here to say I have represented the Bible in the category called theism without mentioning living theism, and then including the open and closed quote text, as people call those. Oh, that's an open theist text. Actually, there's no such thing as that, but you can see how it becomes like that. And then some have even branded passages in the Bible. Oh, that's a Arminian text, or this is a Calvinist text, or this is a pre-trib text, or this is a post-trib. It runs amok, and we don't need to. So that's when we know as biblicists. When do we know it's time to reset? Well, when this becomes at its maximum instability. And again, don't forget that this can happen to anyone. And if it can happen to seminary professors with first names like doctor and last names like PhD, with decades of experience in Bible languages, hermeneutics, systematic theology, it can happen to anybody. So let's approach, as you all have done very well in this class, and collaborating and learning together, collective reasoning, collaborative learning. So continue to endeavor to persevere, but continue to provide your feedback, and have a blessed day.